Oops. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Glad to see you here in person, and hello to those of you who are joining online. This is the Research Ethics and Policy series. My name is Holly Fernandez Lynch. I'm an assistant professor of medical ethics and health policy, and I am the REPS co-chair along with our department's chair, Steve Jaffe. And today we are thrilled to welcome Reshma Ramachandran for a discussion of trends in FDA's adoption of regulatory flexibility and approval of novel medical products, as well as proposals to center health equity in regulatory decision-making. I'll say a couple of words of intro in just a second, a few kind of housekeeping announcements. Reshma is our final REPS speaker of this academic year. We take a break over July and August, and then we'll be back on September 13th with a lecture from Dr. Sherelle Barber of Drexel University on how to do anti-racist science. Believe it or not, we have the REPS schedule for the next academic year completely filled to the brim. So we will be posting that on the Medical Ethics and Health Policy website shortly. So you can mark those dates in your calendar. Although we will have to kind of keep them farther down the calendar, we still would love to hear from you with people that you would like us to consider inviting as prospective speakers, especially folks who come from diverse backgrounds or would contribute diverse perspectives to issues relevant to research ethics and policy. Here is a quick reminder. I don't know where I'm supposed to point this. A not so quick reminder. There we go. Of some online medical ethics resources that we have made available from our department. There are a series of short research ethics courses available for free continuing education credit, some of which can also be used to satisfy the human subjects training requirements at Penn and at CHOP. And then a word of thanks to our several co-sponsors of the Research Ethics and Policy series, and a special thanks to our REPS coordinator, Lisa Bailey. And then we can move on to introduce today's speaker. Reshma Ramachandran is a board-certified family physician and health services researcher. Her research focuses on the realignment of incentives for healthcare stakeholders, including pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and universities, toward prioritizing equitable patient access to safe and effective health technologies. She co-directs the Yale Collaboration for Regulatory Rigor, Integrity, and Transparency, or CRIT, although I've heard with the two R's, it's CRIT. Which is an interdisciplinary initiative that researches medical product evaluation, approval, and coverage toward advancing policies that improve patient outcomes. Reshma trained in medicine at the Alpert Medical School at Brown and in public policy at Harvard's Kennedy School. She completed a family medicine residency at Kaiser Permanente Los Angeles Medical Center and a health services research and policy fellowship as part of the National Clinician Scholars Program at Yale. And she also currently chairs the Doctors for America FDA Task Force and serves as the board president of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines North America. So Reshma, come on up, and just a word about how we'll handle questions and discussion. When the lecture concludes, we'll ask those of you in the room to kick us off with Q&A. Those of you who are online, you can either raise your hand or post your question in the chat. We should be able to unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. And then finally, we are recording this session and we will post the video as soon as it's processed on the Medical Ethics and Health Policy webpage. Okay, thanks, Reshma.
Thanks so much for having me today. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'll just give a word of warning. I do have, I try to keep it as like a minimal number of slides, but this is a big topic, and I will only be scratching the surface around thinking about how regulatory review intersects and interacts with health equity. Here's my disclosures. I don't have any financial conflicts of interest with any sort of commercial entities, but as Holly mentioned, I do serve in some unpaid positions doing advocacy work on the issues I'll present today. So a lot of my work, as Holly mentioned, was looking at the interaction of various stakeholders, really on the patient-physician relationship. And the big one I'll be talking about today, as you can kind of glean from the title of my talk, is the FDA. the FDA, from a clinician perspective, plays a huge role in terms of instilling trust in our relationship with our patients. There's this inherent kind of given for clinicians that if something has been FDA approved, that there has been rigorous review of those medical products to actually determine that safety and efficacy has been established, and the risk-benefit ratio has been minimized so that we can actually offer these options to our patients. And for our patients, this idea of FDA review also has those sorts of connotations as well. So a lot of my work is kind of looking at this interaction between FDA's regulatory review standards and how as we as clinicians interpret those regulatory review standards and make recommendations to our patients. So I'll talk about kind of what's been happening more maybe behind the curtain behind FDA approvals. FDA also has an interactive effect with not just the patient-physician relationship on an individual level, but also on a societal level in terms of thinking about how it shapes innovation. So you can see here from the pipeline from bench to bedside, where FDA review kind of sits after preclinical and clinical research. The regulatory review process has an impact in terms of setting standards for how preclinical and clinical research is done. The bar for approval oftentimes shapes the innovation landscape for medical products that we see coming forward and sets a precedent each time an approval happens based on a new surrogate endpoint or a new clinical outcome, how research can be done in a space. And we saw this probably, most remarkably and probably most well known with what's happening with the Alzheimer's disease drugs, aducanumab and now lecanemab as well. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So in terms of what we've been seeing around trends in the use of expedited or special regulatory review pathways, this kind of highlights this tension that FDA faces in terms of ensuring timely access to new innovations as they come onto the market, as well as balancing that rigorous review that we talked about with safety and efficacy. Over time, though, and this was a study that was done by our group at Yale Crit a few years ago, looking at the adoption of these new pathways that's trying to kind of push that balance a little bit more towards timely access, especially for diseases of unmet need, where there might not be alternatives or there might not be appropriate alternatives for certain populations, the use of these sorts of pathways. Traditionally, FDA has a 10-month period of time between when an application for a new drug or biologic is submitted to them to the approval date. With the use of these expedited review pathways, and there's only a few of them, FDA has now shortened the time period to be 6 months or less. And as you can see here from this graph, we're seeing kind of increased adoption over the past 3 decades of these expedited review programs or these special regulatory programs that enhances also sponsors access, so typically pharmaceutical companies, access to FDA senior reviewers to actually be able to shape what regulatory review actually looks like. So sorry, I know it's a little bit far away, but essentially what this shows is that between 1995 to 2017, increasingly there's been more and more drugs that have been using these pathways for approval by the FDA. On top of that, the standards for review has also changed as well. This figure here actually shows that the time for the duration of the clinical trials, interestingly, has actually increased. So even though we're seeing like faster approvals, trials typically are taking more time to actually be able to look at outcomes, which is kind of an interesting finding and not what we expected when this was done. There's been other studies that have kind of raised this into question, though, where the evidence is a little bit more mixed. But the design of the trials has changed. So on the right-hand side, we've actually seen an increase in terms of how many drugs in particular are actually being tested through single group trials. So that means there's no comparator, no placebo, and no active comparator in which an intervention is being tested against. And this raises questions in terms of, are we understanding really, efficacy in comparison to what's standard of care? And are we also ensuring that there's rigorous evaluation of also safety compared to standard of care as well? Another a piece of looking at what's the underlying evidence and how that's changed. We're actually seeing an increased movement, not just across the special regulatory review programs, those expedited review pathways, but also with overall approvals of moving away from the typical 2 clinical trials that support approval to just 1 clinical trial or 1 pivotal trial that's supporting approval. And this raises questions from a scientific standpoint about replicability. Would we actually see the same results again if another study was done? And this was actually seen with Aduhelm, and probably very startlingly, where you had 2 clinical trials. Initially, they were consolidated as one result, and then the post hoc analysis separated them, and one trial was positive and one trial was negative. And so raising questions on, is this efficacy actually real that we're seeing in terms of the effect on the progression of Alzheimer's disease, or is it not? And we're seeing this across the board, really across all disease areas, but also all special regulatory review programs. And I'll concentrate now on accelerated approval, and I'll talk a little bit about why. This has gotten increased attention, obviously with the Alzheimer's disease drugs, but also other disease areas. And I'll talk a little bit about the promise and kind of why the accelerated approval came about, and that this sort of tension that FDA is facing, again, with timely access while also ensuring rigorous review. So the promise that's made under accelerated approval between FDA and the sponsor is that the sponsor will get earlier access to the market for their products based on surrogate endpoints that are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And reasonably likely actually means that these are unvalidated surrogate endpoints. There's not been an established association between that surrogate endpoint and a clinical outcome in terms of improvement of how patients feel, function, or survive. In return for that earlier access, manufacturers are required typically to actually do a post-approval study to actually confirm that clinical benefit, to actually show and demonstrate that association between a surrogate endpoint and that clinical outcome that patients and clinicians care about. We've seen obviously issues, and we'll talk about this more in terms of where there have been lapses in terms of making sure that back end of that market is actually being fulfilled. And the reason why I want to talk about this today is because the use of accelerated approval has expanded pretty tremendously. Initially it was developed for bringing HIV/AIDS antiretroviral treatment onto the market much more quickly in the midst of a devastating crisis. It's now overwhelmingly used in the oncology space. About 85% of accelerated approvals over the last decade are for hematological and oncologic malignancies. But now we're seeing it also for other areas, for other non-oncology rare diseases such as ALS. We've had some recent approvals in this space, and then also Alzheimer's disease. And so the implication of it moving from a rare disease or smaller patient population to one where there's many more patients means that the implications for not just clinicians and patients, but also payers is much more so. So what does it mean? When we look at accelerated approval, how do we actually assess, even on the pre-approval stage, when the approval happens based on a surrogate endpoint, whether or not the drugs are actually coming through the pipeline are of high therapeutic value at the time of approval. And this is a study that was done by some colleagues at Harvard, where they actually compared accelerated approval drugs that were approved in the United States to drugs that were approved under a similar pathway in Europe. And they actually used the health technology assessments. So these are bodies in Europe where they actually look to see, is there high therapeutic value for the products that are being coming through the pipeline? And they actually tie coverage decisions in those countries based on the therapeutic value. So kind of the one step beyond safety and efficacy to actually what payers usually do in terms of figuring out should they cover this drug or not. And they looked at this because they wanted to see, based on those health technology assessments that happen in Europe, if you applied that sort of same score to what's happening in the US with accelerated approval, would we see similarities in terms of the level of therapeutic value? And what they found, unfortunately, is that about a third across both of these pathways overall for accelerated approval and conditional approval in Europe were found to be of high therapeutic value. So that means 2/3 were low therapeutic value, at least based on these health technology assessment scores. Also, they found in the oncology space, the number even dropped lower. And in the US, there was actually a market difference. So in the US, they actually saw about 30% of oncology drugs, which is the majority of accelerated approvals, were considered high therapeutic value compared to 36% in Europe. The numbers are also different. There was more accelerated approvals compared to conditional approvals by a drug basis across the two entities as well. So this raises questions, obviously, at the time of approval, what are the drugs that are coming through this pipeline? But, we have this back end, we have this confirmation of clinical benefit. So maybe that will also show us whether or not this is actually a beneficial value for our patients. However, we're seeing issues with that too, in terms of even completing the clinical trials that are meant to confirm clinical benefit. This was actually an investigative report that was done by the British Medical Journal around the time when accelerated approval was coming up as an issue. And what they did here is looked at all the accelerated approvals that happened in the United States up until 2020, and they found about 44% had not had a confirmation of clinical benefit. And this didn't include the 16 that had already been withdrawn from the market by the FDA. Of those 112, about 24 of them had been on the market for 5 or more years. So you can imagine from a clinical perspective, these are drugs in which there's not been improving clinical benefit, sitting on the market, being prescribed to patients for 5 years or more. And what they did to, on top of that is actually contact the manufacturers to ask them, what's going on with those 24 drugs in particular that have been on the market for such a long period of time, well beyond the deadlines that FDA has set in terms of completion of those confirmatory trials. And 12 of them, unfortunately, did not give a response. So half did not even respond to the inquiries. But 6 of them had a year later after the 2020 actually had been withdrawn or approved or actually had undergone a regulatory decision-making process. And then for another 6, 4 of them said just recruitment started way later. So there was massive delays in terms of recruitment of patients. And 2 of them were just still discussing trial design. So 5 or more years later, they hadn't even started the trials, and they're still discussing trial design, which is just, very unfortunate from a clinical standpoint of prescribing these drugs where there's not even going to be an end in sight in terms of confirmation of clinical benefit. This was a later study that was done looking at delays in post-approval confirmatory trial completion, where it was for about 100 trials. They found about 50% as of September 2021 were either delayed or delayed or not even completed their trials. So they had blown past the deadline set by the FDA. So again, showing kind of the issues in terms of even completion of these confirmatory trials. So we wanted to look actually though in those other instances. Okay, when the confirmatory trials are done, what are they telling us? Is FDA making decisions that match what those confirmatory trial results look like? And what are the durations for these confirmatory trials? Like, is accelerated approval needed? Because the argument that manufacturers say is that, clinical endpoints take much longer for us to actually look at. We need to have a longer period of time to actually do those trials. So that might delay access for patients. What we found was actually pretty surprising. When we looked at post-approval trial durations for drugs approved by the FDA between 2009 to 2018, we actually saw that based on statistical testing, that the post-approval trial durations were actually similar. There was a 7-month in median difference compared to the pivotal trials. This raised questions, those additional 7 months, should that be necessary for awarding accelerated approval, or should we actually have confirmation of clinical benefit before accelerated approval and not give them this expedited review pathway? And that was also seen when we did a sensitivity analysis looking at clinicaltrials.gov. They have a different completion period. They have a primary completion date that the manufacturers put forward. So we wanted to even look at, based on those metrics, was there a difference between the time it takes to complete those confirmatory trials compared to what actually happened at accelerated approval? And there really wasn't much of a difference. The thing, though, that was really striking to me was just how many of those confirmatory trials did actually not look at clinical endpoints. So you can see here in the sample of 32 trials, 19 of them were using surrogate endpoints as the primary endpoint. So this question of, are we actually confirming clinical benefit with these confirmatory trials, is pretty surprising. We're not actually doing this, and FDA is making regulatory decisions even based on this. And we saw this also with the sensitivity analysis as well. This obviously the concerns for patients and clinicians of not looking at clinical benefit is staggering, but even thinking at a payer perspective, especially Medicare and Medicaid, what does this actually mean? So we actually looked at the same sample of accelerated approval drugs that were approved between 2009 and 2018, wanting to look at how much was being spent by Medicare, both Part B and Part D, and also Medicaid for these accelerated approval drugs. What we found is that for these drugs that were approved, drugs that were approved between 2012 and 2017, because we wanted to have a period of time afterwards to look at their post-approval stage, what we found is about CMS spent about 70 billion through 2020 on these drugs. So a staggering amount. Most of the money, was actually spent after the post-approval studies were completed. So 75% of the funding was actually done, or spending was actually after the post-approval studies were completed. but we found that 60% of that was actually for drugs where the confirmatory trial is based on a surrogate endpoint. So again, not confirmation of clinical benefit and still overwhelming spending by our public payers on drugs of unproven clinical benefit. In response, to this, there's been a lot of chatter about like, okay, well, these trials are really difficult to do, even looking at clinical endpoints. Let's use real world evidence, real world data sources like electronic health records, claims data, registries to be able to do this. And our group also looked at this as well in terms of whether or not the accelerated approval confirmatory trials that are there, can they be replicated using these data sources, electronic health records data, and also claims data. And what we found is that for the 50 trials that had been done or had been designed for accelerated approval drugs that had been approved between 2009 and also 2018, it was not feasible to actually use real world data sources to actually emulate these trials. Big part of it was because the data sources that we had were not able to meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria that randomized control trials were actually set up. On top of that, there was also issues with confounding with the design of the studies using these data sources. So again, raising into question, can we take these shortcuts to actually do these confirmatory trials and actually confirm clinical benefit? All of this, I put this all as kind of like interesting work and like talking. Oh, all this is interesting because like this last year we obviously saw a lot of like questions around like accelerated approval. Should we expand the use of accelerated approval? Can we actually ensure more timely access for our patients? But there was a lot of concern after what happened with aducanumab, which was approved through an accelerated approval process, of whether or not we should actually reform the pathway. And so we wanted to translate like this body of work, and I wanted to kind of like touch upon this about how we kind of do the translation piece of this towards policy reforms to actually to show where are there gaps in accelerated approval and where there can be improvements. And so last year, the US Congress was actually discussing the FDA user fee bills. So FDA is primarily funded through user fees or fees that are paid by the pharmaceutical industry alongside their applications for various drug approvals. For prescription drugs, it funds about 65% of the budget. So it's a huge part of the budget. And with those user fee legislations is where we actually see the emergence of new expedited review pathways. So accelerated approval was not through a user fee legislation, but was codified later on through that. But we wanted to put this kind of like work forward because there was a call to kind of expand the use of accelerated approval outside of the oncology space. And we wanted to point attention to the fact that there were gaps that needed to be addressed. And so you can see here, we wrote some op-eds about some of the work that we did, but also talked to a lot of reporters about, where are there issues from a clinical perspective in terms of how uncertainty from FDA is being translated in our prescribing behavior and also in our interactions with patients. And of course, you've seen this in the news last year, obviously issues with the Alzheimer's disease drug, but also with McKenna, which was a drug that was approved through accelerated approval, had negative confirmatory trials, yet the FDA had extreme difficulty for years to remove that drug from the market, despite not having a proven benefit. And it was interesting to watch kind of the counter arguments. One was there's not another drug, for this indication out there, and we want to be able to offer something. And clinicians talking about their gestalts in whether or not McKenna was actually effective. And then the racial health equity arguments also for McKenna. Preterm birth, which is what the drug was indicated for, is overwhelmingly disproportionately impacting women of color, and specifically Black women. And so there was a big call and big push to say we need to be able to offer something. This drug is available. If you take it off the market, we will be actually exacerbating health disparities. But at the end of the day, this drug was not been proven to work. So what does that mean in terms of offering something to women of color and potentially making health disparities worse on the other end? So there was a lot of interesting kind of like chatter about this. But I bring this up to actually point out, there was actually a big push finally towards reforms to accelerated approval and also increasing FDA's oversight to prevent against delays, but also improve the design of confirmatory trials. And so this was what passed at the end of last year. So with the user fee legislation, they wanted to have a clean bill, just the user fees. And so a lot of the reforms got pushed into the end of year omnibus spending bill. And you can see here, there was basically kind of two big areas that I wanted to highlight in terms of what was included and was notably not included in terms of improving FDA's oversight of the confirmatory trials. So one, it actually requires FDA to actually oversee post-approval confirmatory trial design. So making sure that one, there's clinical endpoints, hopefully, that are being tested instead of surrogate endpoints in those confirmatory studies. Also making sure that the confirmatory studies are underway at the time of approval. And this would prevent against obviously delays or manufacturers saying that we can't recruit patients for the confirmatory study. You'd have it actually done or like started or fully enrolled at the time of approval or within a certain period of time after approval to actually ensure completion and timely completion of those studies. Mandating the sponsor actually submits regular progress reports about their confirmatory studies. So there was a lot of obscurity in terms of where manufacturers were in terms of those completing those confirmatory studies. You saw like the BMJ, when they tried to contact them, half of them didn't respond. So the FDA said, well, as a regulator, we're going to actually make sure they actually give us progress reports every 6 months, outlining a specific process for what withdrawal looks like. So with McKenna, it was years of kind of FDA wanting to have withdrawal of the drug, asking the manufacturer to voluntarily withdraw the drug from the market, which is typically the pathway that was happening beforehand, where FDA would go to them and request that. But if the manufacturer refused to do so, having to go through this long arbitration process. So this way, there was actually clear defined steps on how the withdrawal would occur. I would say it's a little bit permissive, to be honest. We'll see how it actually works in practice. And then also considering the lack of the completion of progress reports. So if they don't submit an update every 6 months, or if they don't complete their confirmatory trials, it would be considered a prohibited act. So FDA can actually take more action against the sponsor under the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, and also creating an accelerated approval council. So now that accelerated approval is moving outside of the oncology space, outside of HIV/AIDS into other disease areas, making sure there's kind of a shared understanding of accelerated approval, what types of drugs should be actually receiving this pathway and what shouldn't. And also checking up on every especially 3 times a year on what's going on with accelerated approval across different divisions of the FDA. The things that it notably does not include is one, not having an automatic expiration for accelerated approval drugs that don't actually confirm clinical benefit or have unnecessary delays. This is what a number of other countries actually have in place, including in Europe, in the UK, in Australia, Japan. And so this is something that we would hope for, especially given that we found, the post-approval studies do not need that long of a period of time to actually be completed. Unfortunately, that was stripped away from the bill when it went into the omnibus bill. And then on top of that, the requirements for labeling. So sending a signal to clinicians and also patients in terms of what the level of evidence is behind accelerated approval. That confirmation of clinical benefit is still pending, that it was based on a surrogate endpoint. But whether or not that would also, change behavior in some ways. And that's the part that really got us thinking about, how does FDA actually communicate uncertainty to clinicians in particular, and also to patients through their clinicians about these new drugs that are coming through the pathway where there is not confirmation of clinical benefit. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The one thing I just want to point out is that for a lot of these reforms, there's been some hope and there's also skepticism. And a big part of it is in terms of how FDA is going to actually operationalize this, right? How the agency is actually going to implement this. There's been this continued use of accelerated approval, even as these reforms were being passed and afterwards, as a rescue pathway. So trials that were designed to look at clinical endpoints as their primary endpoint, instead being approved based on a secondary or an exploratory endpoint that's a surrogate. So they were not intended to actually for the accelerated approval pathway, but FDA is going ahead to be able to provide them approval somehow. The enforcement discretion is left at the hands of the FDA. So there's a lot of language in the bill that says may, the agency may do this, but not shall, so not a requirement. There's not a real clear evaluation process for success. So, whether or not these reforms are achieving the intended goal, providing more assurance of completion of those confirmatory trials is kind of unclear. And that accelerated approval council that I mentioned before is actually a closed body of just Senate directors without a public component. There's only a report that's going to be issued on a yearly basis. There's an unclear validation process for surrogate endpoints. So all those unvalidated surrogate endpoints, you'd hope there would be continued studies or evaluation by the FDA to actually say, hey, there's a clear association based on the literature in terms of its correlation or association with clinical endpoints. That's not happening on a routine basis by the FDA, and FDA is not withdrawing surrogate endpoints that are later found to be unproven as well. So that's kind of left up in the air too. And then what's complicating matters is also the reform of FDA advisory committees. So FDA is undergoing this process of reforming how independent experts advise them and whether or not they would vote on specific products or not. So that's also kind of interacting as well in terms of how these reforms might be implemented and whether or not we can actually make sure the regulators implementing the reforms that's being centered on patients and not necessarily the sponsors. So I mentioned before kind of the issue around the label and like why we are also kind of interested in looking at how uncertainty is being communicated to other stakeholders and namely clinicians and also payers. So we we finished up this project and it's being written up right now. So I wanted to kind of share some of our preliminary findings for a subset of these accelerated approvals. There's a certain number of guidelines, 3 guidelines specifically, that Medicare in particular uses to make coverage decisions. And these guidelines usually give a score to a drug and indication, and that will signal to Medicare, yes, go ahead and cover the drug and provide reimbursement for this. And so we wanted to look at these guidelines because in clinical practice, most of us don't look at drug labels. Most of us don't look at like the studies necessarily that are undergirding, drug approvals. And we usually look at our clinical practice guidelines to actually make decisions. And so that what's in the guidelines really reflects usually clinical practice, or at least we hope it does. So we did a study wanting to look at the National Comprehensive Cancer Network guidelines, because these are one of the 3 guidelines that Medicare uses to make reimbursement decisions, and wanting to see whether or not, do they mention this uncertainty? How do they communicate this to clinicians? And specifically, we looked at oncology drugs that have been granted accelerated approval, and this is for this subset. Our larger sample is 2009 to 2018, but just for what I'm presenting now, it'll just be 2016 to 2018. And we want to see how often do the NCCN guidelines actually disclose that the therapeutics were approved through the accelerated approval pathway. How often do they actually describe the primary endpoint and whether or not that endpoint is actually a surrogate marker? Do they actually provide information about the post-approval confirmatory trials, and do their guidelines actually comport with those trials? And do the recommendations actually also match FDA status? So if the FDA withdrew the drug from the market, do they actually then remove it from the guidelines? And I'll find, some of the findings were actually quite surprising. This sample actually included 36 therapeutic indications that were granted accelerated approval between 2016 and 2018. The full sample is 62, and 31 indications had 1 post-approval study, and the other 5 had 2 studies to confirm clinical benefit. And as you can see here, a majority of them do not mention the words accelerated approval, that confirmation of clinical benefit is still pending, does not convey the uncertainty behind a number of these drugs that have gone on accelerated approval. And we looked as far back. So even before the confirmatory trials were done, we actually collected all the NCCN guidelines even prior to completion of the confirmatory studies to actually check to see, do they mention this at all when the guidelines got updated. Some of them did. And all of them did name the specific surrogate marker. So in cancer, it's oftentimes response rate or progression-free survival, but they don't acknowledge or say these are surrogate endpoints by which the approval actually occurred. So none of them actually mentioned the word surrogate endpoint. There's also inconsistencies, pretty significant inconsistencies between the guidelines and the post-approval study results. We saw that for positive studies, the confirmatory, the guidelines actually did match positive studies. So they'll either keep it in the guideline or they might raise the level of evidence behind them. But for negative studies, there was more of a discordance. So they might sometimes acknowledge that there was a negative study, but then the guideline would continue to recommend this. The justification more often than not was that there's no other treatment options available. So we'll still continue to recommend this in the guidelines. Or sometimes they might not even mention the negative study at all and continue to recommend it in the guideline without referencing it as well. And then there was this was a surprising part, that there was actually inconsistencies between the guidelines and FDA's actions. So you can see here, when it was converted from accelerated approval to traditional approval, there was oftentimes acknowledgement or reference in the guidelines and alignment with the FDA decision. However, when it was withdrawn from the market, there were instances where the guidelines continue to recommend these drugs, which means that payers would still pay for these drugs despite not being on the market. And you might think, okay, well, the drug's not on the market because FDA's withdrawn it, so it won't be reimbursed. But you have to remember that FDA doesn't approve specific drugs; they approve drugs for indications. So oftentimes these cancer drugs had multiple indications they were on the market for. So Medicare was then reimbursing for off-label uses of these drugs for various indications. So this was, to me, really surprising that there wasn't concordance between FDA's decision and also what was in the guidelines. And again, the rationale was the same. There's no other treatment options available, so we'll continue to recommend in the guidelines. So, So we talked about obviously uncertainty with accelerated approval, but I'll also just kind of put forward and just briefly mention this, that this uncertainty also lies outside of accelerated approval. We actually looked at drugs that were approved by the FDA between 2018 and 2021, some excluding accelerated approval, most of them not, and actually found that about 10% of them actually missed their primary endpoint, clinical or surrogate or otherwise, and were approved by the FDA. The other surprising part for me is that, okay, there can be uncertainty, but maybe FDA is going to require a study to be done to actually confirm, or justify why this clinical endpoint might have been missed. And about a third of those only had post-marketing requirements, or were FDA required studies to be done to actually assess whether or not the drug actually could meet the missed clinical endpoint or missed primary endpoint. And the other surprising thing is that most of the time, even though the drugs might have missed the primary endpoint, advisory committees were not convened. And advisory committees are typically convened when there is uncertainty for drugs that FDA is considering for approval. So just kind of a last few things. The reason why I brought up kind of the outside of accelerated approval and really wanted to talk about where there's uncertainty in sort of evidence and why is FDA making these decisions despite all this uncertainty, is that we've kind of seen the shift over time of where FDA has talked about employing greater regulatory flexibility. This idea that even though the trial doesn't show this, doesn't meet like what pre-specified or its hypothesis, we're still going to go ahead with approval because there's an unmet need, or we can rely on post-approval studies, or sometimes a pledge from the sponsor, which is what happened in this case, which is Holly obviously has written about with Rachel Sachs about this idea of like this soft commitment that was made in an advisory committee meeting where the FDA turned over to the sponsor and said, if your confirmatory trial, your phase 3 trial doesn't show a clinical benefit, you'll take it off the market, right? And they said yes, and FDA went ahead and approved it, not under accelerated approval where there is a clear off ramp, but under just a traditional approval pathway. The sponsor a few weeks later kind of backtracked, by the way, on that commitment and said that they may or may not withdraw the drug from the market, even if the study turned out to be negative. But you can see that there's this increasing trend over time of employing this idea of regulatory flexibility, where FDA is deviating from its standards or its policy to actually approve drugs, based on need. And this is a paper that Holly had led, and that was recently came out last week around recommendations for how this balance, how this shifting this burden of uncertainty onto patients and clinicians might be reset in some ways, and how regulatory flexibility that FDA is trying to employ might be matched by increasing back-end additional post-approval requirements. So the idea that if FDA is saying, hey, we're going to employ more regulatory flexibility, there's going to be more uncertainty on the front end than on the back end. FDA, even outside of accelerated approval, where it's clearly, there's a clear pathway for requiring these studies, FDA could require additional studies, even for traditional pathways as well. Highly recommend reading. But I just wanted to come back to this because there's been, it was striking. I participated in the lecanemab, the Alzheimer's disease drug, open public hearing, giving a comment about the drug. I was really concerned not on the efficacy part, although I did have concerns there, but on the safety issues with the drug. And I was kind of struck by the number of participants on there who oftentimes brought up this issue around racial health equity as justification for approving this drug. Alzheimer's disease disproportionately impacts, patients of color. In Black Americans, it's around twice the incidence or twice the prevalence compared to white Americans. And for Hispanic population, it's usually 1.5 times. And so there was this big push, and there's been a recruitment of a number of groups to really convince FDA, but also CMS to cover the drug based on this argument. And I would argue that, in fact, like we're seeing kind of the opposite trend. This is actually going to do the exact opposite of what's being intended. By having and employing more of this regulatory flexibility without having appropriate safeguards, we might be actually putting out more drugs that are unproven benefit and keeping them on there longer and putting these patients at harm even longer, especially in these populations that are most vulnerable. And not just obviously racial and ethnic minorities, but also older adults and women as well. And this came up actually very recently because FDA is thinking about, can they expand the scope of awarding these expedited review designations or special regulatory program designations to actually drugs that might have a potential benefit for health disparities. This is specifically for devices. FDA put out guidance saying that they wanted to expand the breakthrough device program designation to products that actually might have the potential. So this is very, very early clinical stages where it might have the potential to actually address health disparities. So there's not been a proven clinical benefit for these devices, but FDA will give this special designation, and that allows them faster approvals through this pipeline, and also increased access to FDA reviewers through this pipeline as well. We argue, though, because we had studied the breakthrough device program and we saw a lot of issues around uncertainty at the time of approval and issues with safety with a lot of these products that are coming through this pipeline, that in fact, it might do the opposite. And so a lot of the focus, unfortunately, has been on like representation solely as the issue on health equity and looking at FDA regulatory review standards. And we argue that instead, FDA should actually strengthen the regulatory review standards to actually improve health equity. And this can happen in the pre-approval stage by saying that the designation needs to have more evidence to actually show that it's actually to address health disparities, but also on the post-approval stage, where FDA can require additional studies to actually say, hey, does this actually, benefit the population you intend to treat? Or are you actually reducing health disparities, especially when other factors, other structural factors around cost and access come into play as well? So this is the framework that we put out in terms of how FDA, but also FDA in collaboration with other agencies, can actually address health equity in improving the regulatory review standards, but also coordination in terms of coverage and access issues as well. And this doesn't apply just to medical devices. We're also seeing this obviously with drugs, especially drugs that are administered at hospitals and infusion centers, where access might be privileged to just a few who can be able to make it there. And so, the reason why, a big part of like the work that we were doing, I came into, I'll say, just a regulatory review sort of work just generally, is because I was an HIV/AIDS activist, like worried about like the cost of HIV/AIDS drugs. I worked in South Africa, saw a lot of issues with how intellectual property and pricing was like inhibiting access. And in studying this more and more, realizing that what regulators do in terms of what they allow to kind of come to the market, how they actually communicate evidence around safety and efficacy is intrinsically tied to how we think about the value of these products, and not just innovation, but also who's going to be able to access them as well. And so I would argue, strengthening regulatory standards is imperative to actually improving health equity, and especially for pharmaceutical access, and making sure that our patients, especially our most marginalized, get access to health technologies that would be beneficial to them. So I ended there. Want to make sure I left room for questions. And I know went fast, so really feel to ask me any questions that you have. Okay, great.
Questions in the room?
I have one that's going to show my ignorance, but could you explain what the difference is between what happens when a drug is approved through the regular pathways and they just sort of follow it along in the population to see if there are negative impacts, and the actual testing of the drugs that could be accelerated impact?
Yeah. So with traditional approval, after the drug's approved and is onto the market, typically the only sorts of studies that are done are pharmacovigilance or looking for safety issues. And those are usually like voluntary, like safety signals that are sent to the FDA. So it was like a clinician or a patient, or even usually the pharmaceutical company, if something does come up as a safety issue, they'll submit a report to the FDA. So it's mostly voluntary. And we study this to find that, unfortunately, like most of the safety signals come from the manufacturer and not from like might be happening in the real world. Sometimes they set up things like patient registries where like clinicians or others might have to input data about like what's happening in response to structured questions after approval, to actually figure out, are there differences between populations in terms of the effects, or usually like safety concerns that might emerge, or wanting to see whether or not there might be new indications that could be used, especially if it's being used off-label. Because once the drug comes onto the market, theoretically a clinician can prescribe it for something outside of the FDA indication as well. With accelerated approval, FDA usually requires a trial to be done. Although there is like flexibility in this, there's nothing prescriptive to say like you need to have a randomized double-blind, trial that's going forward. And for a lot of cancer drugs, it oftentimes is a single arm trial. So it's just the drug being given to patients in practice, not being compared against, a standard of care or a placebo. And they're looking to see, is there evidence of overall survival being in patients who receive the drug, and is there safety concerns that they need to look out for. But there's a deadline for those post-marketing requirements that FDA sets. And in response to whatever the results are, FDA can withdraw the drug from the market if it's negative. For traditional approval, they theoretically could, and they do have the authority to do this if something comes up in terms of safety and efficacy. More often than not, safety is the trigger for withdrawing a drug that's come out that has been approved through the traditional pathway, but not efficacy. And it's harder, like FDA acknowledges itself, that it's very difficult to remove a drug off the market because there's no clear off ramp. Like with accelerated approval, where there's a deadline set, there's going to be after your review, and there's going to be a conversion point from accelerated approval to traditional approval at that point. Helpful, thank you. Yeah. Sorry.
I was just really struck by you saying that when there's not a drug on the market, people want to give someone something in order to help. And I guess the question I have for you, and I know this is subjective, but like, part of that's like, yeah, you want to be helpful, but is art also part of it, like it's something that it's the money related with that you're actually buying this drug.
Yeah. So if I just are you asking a little bit about like the conflict of interest sort of issue, or
I'm asking
like for the impacts on the patient in terms of like
the when you say that this drug is not actually working, and people are still
Yeah.
continuing to want to prescribe it,
Yeah.
do you think it's mostly this like feeling like you need to be able to give them something, or is it that you're going to get reimbursed somehow for the having them buy this drug?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's mixed, I will say, but I will say, like, in the perfect world of thinking about like a clinician as like a being that's unaffected by a conflict of interest, I do think there is a push to want to be able to prescribe something.
Right.
I mean, this is just obviously anecdotal in clinical practice, but we also know from large surveys when there's been if there's an intervention available, like clinicians will go towards like prescribing something versus not doing anything, just generally. But the financial aspect is interesting because especially with oncology drugs and drugs that are administered in a hospital or an infusion setting or an outpatient clinic, there is a reimbursement incentive. With Medicare Part B drugs in particular, there's a 6% markup that clinicians or the facility receives when they administer the drug. And the conflict of interest issues come up in terms of who sits on the guideline committees and who's going to continue to recommend the drug, despite the evidence being not great, and then also the ones who like present at these FDA meetings as well, where you can find their direct financial ties, both personally in terms of when they prescribe it, but also if they're a consultant or things like that. With Biogen, we have a paper coming out about this, but with Biogen, with even before aducanumab, with their multiple sclerosis drug, they actually had a huge multi-billion-dollar marketing campaign, like direct detailing, paying clinicians, and they looked to see how many units clinicians were prescribing and would target them for inviting them to be on scientific advisory boards, but did not actually meet with them for those purposes at all, or having them on the payroll as consultants. And it was like thousands of clinicians around the country that they did this for. And it's pretty astounding just to see like this is a part of like the business model of how they actually inculcate the need or the desire to be able to prescribe something.
I'm curious about your thoughts on whether or not the FDA actually has the capacity to do the things that you were outlined in the Omnibus Act. I know they had a budget bump in this next fiscal year, but it's not that big of a bump. No,
that's something that we're quite worried about from two aspects. Like, so one, there's obviously the user fees that FDA that has a majority of FDA's prescription drug budget. The user fees are the way that they come about, and the agreement of like what those user fees can be used for happen because of negotiations between industry and FDA behind closed doors of like what they want the user fees to be applied. When we looked at the user fee agreements, and Aaron Mitchell has done a really great study to also outline this as well. There's basically nothing for post-approval studies oversight. And we know from medical reviewers that their time is like clocked based on, so if a drug gets like an accelerated approval or prior review, they have that period of time that they have to complete the review, and their time is clocked to meet that approval, like the accelerated approval deadline, but they don't have a budget necessarily for doing that oversight of the post-approval side. Majority of the time is for the review of the approval stage. So it's a huge problem in terms of capacity, and also FDA has a number of openings, a number of vacancies, and with now we're in the post-pandemic retirement / people leaving the FDA. So it's a huge problem. And then on top of that, FDA's adopted more and more expedited review pathways. One of them is called this real-time oncology review pathway, which came under under 21st Century Cures, which was another big FDA bill. And that actually allows manufacturers to get approval within 5 months or less of not just supplemental oncology indications, but new oncology indications. We looked at this and it was a median of 3 months. So you can imagine with that sort of time crunch, like the capacity that they have is limited. And so this is where the work we've been also trying to do is like, where can congressional appropriations be strengthened to actually meet that sort of promise of these reforms? Because this is a huge problem in terms of their capacity.
A lot of questions, but I'll try to do one. And it really relates to the finance of developing devices and drugs.
Yeah.
So the last time with this in some years, I mean, the big pharmaceutical companies were averaging a 17% margin. Theoretically, that should, we invest in our education research on our 4% margin, but it should be enough that they can run big trials and do this. As these drugs and devices become more niche, there's a lot of little companies and they're investor supported, and there's tremendous pressure from the investors for early return, and then that's passed on to the companies. So I'm right in the middle of one right now as a consortium with multi-cancer early detection devices, which got breakthrough device, which is hard for me to see how that's promoting equity without earning coverage. And traditionally you earn coverage through a large trial proving reduction in mortality, but they've got huge investors behind it. That was a comment that'll not a question, but allow you to respond.
No, it's been really interesting. I will say the small companies and the dynamics also with venture capital is fascinating, especially because the terms of the agreements, like for instance, especially with universities working with these small companies, and whether or not you can actually put in more conditions around like the type of evidence or affordability or like access issues. The venture capital folks would be like, no, we have clear red lines. We standardize a template for what our red lines is. And it's very hard to kind of move them because they expect these like big margins, even when there's like issues around like health equity, which population you're intending to treat. So, it's a huge problem. I do think, the other part of this too, there's a financial calculus of like, if we get this breakthrough disease designation or breakthrough device or, program designation, we know we can come to the market like X days earlier or X months earlier, which means earlier coverage. And especially for medical devices where there's parallel review usually between CMS and FDA, they want to like shorten that period as much as they can so that they can start earning money. And they can also, make money off during the monopoly period that they have when they have a patent or when they hold an exclusivity period as well. So the financial calculus is just like fascinating in many ways. But when we talk to like scientists at some of these companies, they tell us like these trials like aren't as burdensome as we think. So there's kind of this like, this is an area I'd like to like delve into more in terms of like, what do these trials actually entail? Like, how can we make them more efficient? Because we've seen over time, especially with things like gene therapies, for instance, the cost of goods have come down. The ability to do trials has gotten easier depending on what area you're looking at. So why aren't we like doing some best practices to kind of make these trials more efficient so they can, achieve their intended goal of getting to market quickly, but at the same time, it's not the expense of like sacrificing safety or efficacy as a part of the process. But I think a part of it is like, FDA has these conversations with a lot of these companies behind closed doors, but it's not out in the open enough. And this is where we'd argue like the advisory committee process, because they can do this, shouldn't just be product specific, but even having these questions about like, what can we do to actually improve the research ecosystem so that patient outcomes also meets like what the company is hoping for as well.
Reshma, I have a question from Kristen Harkins online, and she asks if you can share your thoughts on the CMS coverage with evidence development requirement for anti-amyloid therapies. Does this usurp the FDA's role to determine what drugs should be available, or is it appropriate for ensuring that the necessary post-market testing occurs, or maybe both?
I'm of the mindset that I think it's totally within CMS's mandate because they have a different requirement for thinking about coverage. They're thinking about whether or not a product is reasonable and necessary for their beneficiaries, which is very different than safety and efficacy. and especially for the case of the anti-amyloids, they saw, for instance, that Medicare beneficiaries, in terms of their characteristics, what other drugs are on, their comorbidities, were not represented in the trials that actually led to accelerated approval, both for aducanumab, but also lecanemab as well. And so the concerns of they want to actually have that additional evidence to know whether or not it's reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries makes sense to me. On top of that, CMS has just a different mandate. They are a payer. They have to think about how are they going to be able to provide coverage for the product, which patients would actually see benefit from these products, and they have to actually think from as a public payer, also from a budgetary standpoint, like how are they to ensure that these sorts of treatments, as they bring them online, especially for such a prevalent population, won't break the bank, especially when there is continued uncertainty with accelerated approval. So I think it's completely appropriate. And there's been a lot of interesting misinformation. I will also say in terms of what CMS does and does not do. I just remember seeing billboards. I was in DC recently that says that CMS does not covers every drug except for Alzheimer's, and I was like, that's not true. That's definitely not true. They make these determinations. They have protected classes, but even in this case, they are covering the drug. They're just asking for more evidence along the way. And I think for me, I had within the first week of aducanumab being approved, I had 2 patients and their families coming in asking me about this because they got emails from some patient advocacy organizations, telling them about the new drug approval. And I just remember feeling completely lost, at that point, in a sense that, FDA had made this decision to approve the drug. And I was just not seeing, the efficacy results that they were purporting. And the safety concerns were just so significant that I can imagine for others, trying to answer those questions of am I the patient that would benefit for this? Would I be at risk if I take this drug? We just didn't have the answers, and we still don't have the answers. And CMS providing that sort of at least additional safeguard of collecting that evidence, and you'd hope would be in concert, honestly, with what the FDA was doing as well. But it's just reassuring that at least they're going to be looking to see what the population level impacts are, but also from an individual perspective, how we can actually counsel our patients as more and more evidence gets collected.
I will squeeze in a question of my own, if that's okay. Oh, did you have your hand up? Yeah, you were first.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding everything correctly. Currently, there's no deterrence for a company if they release a drug that is not necessarily killing the patients, but is not helping them. There's no deterrent for them to not keep it on the market. So if someone has that sweet spot where people aren't actively dying, but it's also not helping them, then that's their golden goose. Is that?
Yeah, I'll see from so yes. This is where the payer. So the biggest deterrent or honestly incentive is the payer. So if the payer decides not to cover it, so Medicare, Medicaid, or other big payers, like we saw with aducanumab, say they're not going to cover it, that's really the only deterrent for the company to actually not pursue, or to put the drug on the market.
Okay, so now my follow-up to that is, for the majority of the folks that are within the Medicaid and the Medicare system, they're, elderly, usually minority. There's an inherent distrust of the medical system to begin with. So I do find it interesting that they're trying to cloak it in we want to make sure that it's more advantageous for these communities when, I'm sure that if there were some sort of epigenetic study, they would say, well, actually, the medical industry complex is the reason why these populations are more susceptible to these conditions. So I find it really interesting that they're we're the thing that caused the bad thing, and now we're using the bad thing that we caused as a reason to continue to not help this population.
Yeah.
All right, that's all.
Yeah, no, I will say, for some light reading, the Committee of Oversight and Reform and also the Committee of Energy and Commerce in Congress did an investigative report, an 18-month investigation of what happened with Biogen and aducanumab. And one of the findings that was that, Biogen had, it was 33 billion, if I remember correctly, on a marketing campaign, primarily targeting organizations that are within these communities to be able to put up this narrative of, this drug is going to be helping, addressing health equity issues and whatnot. We at one point, we wanted to do a secret shopper campaign, and still, if anybody was interested, okay, we'll do this. Because when the drug got approved, Biogen put out these press releases immediately, being like, we're collaborating with this group, and we're gonna be putting out patient education materials. It was like the National Minority Quality Forum, the project CVS, which is the clinics that are oftentimes in underserved populations, like a bunch of them, and they were doing like educational stuff, and we wanted to see what are these materials like, how are they framing the issue, you know, how are these interactions happening between organizations and the company, but exactly that, I mean, but it's all a part of like the business model. How can they increase their market share, even in populations that haven't even bothered to test these drugs in, and it's maddening to say the least. Yeah.
All right, well, before we thank Reshma, I was remiss in failing to thank an important co-sponsor, the Department of Family Medicine, who helped us get Reshma here at Penn for a really fabulous and thought-provoking talk. So thank you both.